Today we're going to talk about Democrats failing to create a carve-out in the filibuster for voting rights, but also some bright spots ahead of midterms and what could still turn things around ahead of November. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So this week, the culmination of the Democrats' efforts to create a carve-out in the filibuster for voting rights ended, as expected, with Sinema and Manchin siding with Republicans to keep the filibuster in place, even as voter suppression laws are being passed in states across the country with simple majorities, even after Republican-led state legislatures are reorganizing local elections boards in Georgia, even as half of all mail-in ballot applications are being rejected in Texas, even as states are being gerrymandered to ensure Republican majorities, even despite all of this happening right under our noses, still Manchin and Sinema decided that the real risk here was the division that might come from changing an arbitrary Senate procedural rule. Yeah, no, that sounds pretty dangerous. And so I understand how infuriating all of this is, and if you've been watching regularly, you'll know that this is the principal issue that I've been focused on since the minute Democrats took the majority. And we all know the implications of this stuff because, I've spoken about it at length, and if you've spent more than 7 minutes on your phone, it's become abundantly clear. So I wanted to take this time to focus instead on some of the wins that we're seeing on this front and some of the solutions here so that it's not just doom and gloom. So let's start in Ohio. The state Supreme Court struck down a gerrymandered Republican map that was 12-3 in Republicans' favor, meaning they would hold 80% of the seats despite winning about 55% of the statewide vote. Now, Democrats were able to challenge this vote thanks to an amendment to the Ohio Constitution that was overwhelmingly passed by the voters in 2018. Now, even though the Ohio Supreme Court is 4-3 in Republicans' favor, the Republican Chief Justice joined the three Democrats in overturning the map. So now the legislature has 30 days to try again. If not, the Ohio Redistricting Commission gets a go at it. But in either case, this could mean that Democrats see an additional 2 to 3 seats, which could very well be the difference between a Speaker Pelosi and a Speaker McCarthy. So some really promising news out of a state that none of us would have expected good news from. Another bright spot, North Carolina. Now, Republicans had passed an 11-3 map to replace the current 8-5 map. So a pretty brutal gerrymander in a state that's known for pretty brutal gerrymanders. That map was challenged in court. Now, so far, the lower court did uphold the map, but the case will likely end up in the North Carolina Supreme Court, where Democrats have a 4-3 majority. And the courts in North Carolina have been moving quickly on redistricting cases since in the past, these cases would drag on and elections were happening with maps that were later found unconstitutional. So that shouldn't be the case here. Moving on to Texas, there have been issues around requesting mail ballot applications where voters are required to provide the identification number that they used when they first registered to vote. So that's either their driver's license number or a social security number. But if they give the number that doesn't match what's on record, they'll automatically get rejected. Now, voters should provide both numbers if they can't remember, but local elections officials aren't allowed to tell voters this because that would be considered promoting mail-in voting, which is now illegal under SB 1. Pretty grim stuff. Like, the point of this law was to make it harder to vote. It is working as intended. But now, Beto O'Rourke's campaign is deploying 44,000 volunteers to contact 2 million Texans. That's through door knocking, phone calls, texts, letters, and that is with the intention of educating voters on navigating the changes from SB 1. Like 44,000 volunteers is a pretty massive group of people, and that'll hopefully counteract the Republicans' biggest weapon to suppress the vote. And aside from all of that, it's worth remembering too, during Wisconsin's 2020 Supreme Court race, and that was while COVID was first surging, we had no vaccine, Republicans blocked efforts to send mail-in ballots to all voters. Now that, on top of staffing shortages in Milwaukee that left only 5 out of 180 polling places open, and that led to 4-hour lines, all of that was a purposeful tactic to sink Democratic chances in the election. And yet, Democrat Joe Karofsky won that seat by over 160,000 votes in Wisconsin, in a state that's usually decided by 20,000 vote margins. It was 20,000 votes in 2016, another 20,000 the other way in 2020. When Republicans try to strip away your voting rights, it doesn't come without backlash. And by the way, beyond all of that, a lot can happen in 10 months. Midterms aren't until November. The political environment that we're in right now isn't necessarily the political environment that we're going to be in by the time we're casting ballots. We could still make progress on Build Back Better, on COVID, on the economy, on stabilizing inflation. There's still a lot of time for Biden's approval rating to recover, for the pandemic to improve, to deliver some legislation that'll pass muster for both Manchin and Sinema, and I'll reserve comment on Manchin and Sinema beyond that for the sake of my blood pressure and yours. So look, again, none of this is to say that we have an easy road ahead of us or that these anti-democratic measures in the states won't mean fewer people can vote or that democratic voices won't be diluted. But before you throw your hands up and just say, fuck it, what's the point? Why bother showing up? Why bother fighting? Just remember, 96% of Democrats voted in favor of protecting voting rights versus 0% of Republicans. So the answer here isn't to give up and let the Republicans win. It's not to give the people who are completely against you the victory. It's to keep fighting. We are almost there. We elect literally two more senators and hold the House, and everything left on the chopping block in 2021 could be a reality in 2022. Along with deeper reforms like court expansion and codifying Roe and a federal $15 minimum wage. Republicans want you to feel hopeless because they know how close we are to winning right now. Don't give them the satisfaction. As always, check out my recent interviews, including with Congressman Adam Schiff and MSNBC's Mehdi Hasan in the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel.